Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Morales, and if you're new here, my YouTube channel focuses on learning how to follow Jesus in an everyday kind of way. And today we are joined by Dr. Kurt Jaros, and he is from Veracity Hill. And we will be discussing the topic of original sin. For those that are not sure what that means, it has to do with what we read in the Bible, having to do with Adam and Eve and how their actions impacted all of humanity. So we're going to call him Dr. J, or Kurt, if he's okay with that too. We're going to have him explain to us what the thought was like throughout history and even today, having to do with original sin. And then towards the end, we're going to also be answering your questions that you submitted ahead of time for this interview. So let's begin by welcoming Kurt, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Susan. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to talk about my bread and butter, original sin. I've been interviewed a number of times, and I smile a lot just naturally. It's sort of the weirdest thing having a guy talk about, original sin and the corruption of human nature and smiling while talking about it.
It's just your personality, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
That's good. I'm the opposite. Many people tell me, smile. So if I look like not happy, I'm actually smiling on the inside.
There you go. Sure.
What was interesting to me was when we were scheduling for this interview, I suggested this topic and you're like, good, easy for me. And so the goal is for us to at least be a little more confident. For those of us that this topic, we wouldn't say that easy for us, right? So we're glad that we have someone here that it is a topic of his expertise. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit of your education and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Let me start young here. I was born and raised in a Christian home, and I went to church every Sunday. And I was the sort of kid that paid attention in Sunday school class. And so when the teacher would ask a question, I was not the guy to give those stock answers, Jesus, God, the Bible, whatever. I mean, I literally, I had the answers. And, for me, just even at a young age, I took an interest to Christianity and the Christian faith and Christian theology. And in high school, I asked the deep questions of life, and I began to explore apologetics and got interested in that. It was also my time at Biola University for my undergrad that I really became aware of the theological positions that come forward from biblical interpretation. And I was frequently told that, you're either a Calvinist or you are an Arminian. And as I was exploring these two camps, I realized, I definitely was not a Calvinist. And the Arminianism description, though, didn't really fit me either. And so I sort of felt a little lost. And I'm not the type of person that claims to be a Calminian. I mean, people say that because they just don't know what to believe. And, that's okay to say, I don't know. And I just began to explore more, research more. And I stumbled across these monks from the 5th and 6th century in southern France. This is long before France was called France. It was Roman Gaul. And began to explore their writings, what they wrote, and the tradition that they came from. They did not sort of create a middle ground between Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius. I know we're sort of jumping in right into names here, but they came from the Greek theological tradition. So I began to read the Greek church fathers, and that really got me interested in thinking about the issues of salvation and human nature and original sin and free will and grace. And so that's really sort of what got me going. And I stayed at Biola for a master's degree in Christian apologetics. And then after I finished that, I got married and moved to London, England, where I did a master's degree in systematic theology from King's College London, and came back to Chicagoland, where I'm originally from, And Chicagoland is just the colloquial way of saying the suburbs of Chicago, the metropolitan area. And then I started a couple years later a PhD studying these Gallic monks and specifically their views of original sin. And this is something that had been very much neglected in the academic literature. There was only one conference paper later published as a journal article, something like 5 pages, I think, on John Cassian's view of original sin. So really there just had not been much research in this area. And so here's my dissertation, and it's on my desk because I figured even though this was easy, I should brush up on some of the deep matters here that we might get into. So that's a little bit about myself. I'm a theologian, speaker, teacher with my ministry, Veracity Hill. I did a podcast by the same name for 4 years. And the tagline was striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So I had an opportunity to network and interview scholars, apologists, theologians, social leaders, and just sometimes everyday people and learning about their Christian lives. And so now I've launched Veracity Hill as a full-scale ministry, not just a podcast. And so I've been doing some fundraising this season and putting out some videos and engaging with the likes of Bart Ehrman. I did a 6-part video series last year on Bart Ehrman and specifically his book, Misquoting Jesus, which was very well received by Bart, believe it or not. And sometimes I've got some flack from Christians for the positions that I was defending therein. But it was a fun series to do. So yeah, that's a little bit about me in a nutshell. I'm a big Cubs fan. I drink Dr. Pepper. I've got a family. I play basketball and baseball when I can. So.
Good. I like Dr. Pepper too.
Yes.
And
right.
I was going to ask you a question that came from Noel and Liva, which he wants to know, when will your thesis book come out?
I've had a number of people ask this question, and I'm really grateful that people are interested in the subject matter. My goal this year is to have a contract from a publisher by June 1st. So I'm beginning to, I'm doing a little bit more polishing on it, even though I don't have to before I'm contacting publishers, but I've been collecting rubrics. So publishers have different requirements for what they're seeking. And I'm also considering there's a whole philosophy of publishing, so if I were to explore an academic publisher, that's a publisher at some university, the book might cost more and fewer people may buy it. I could go with a more popular publisher, but it wouldn't have that reputation as an academic book. So there are pros and cons here that I'm still sort of weighing before I make my first attempt. And that could take a while because sometimes they take a while to get back to you and they might reject you. Then you got to go to someone else and they could reject you again. So it's a big, long process. And so that's the issues I'm weighing. But thank you for your patience as I continue to polish the work here and take some things out. The first chapter in a PhD is typically what's called a literature survey. And that's just a way of saying, hey, I've researched all these books and here's what these people say, but they haven't written on what I'm going to write on. It's really kind of boring. So you want to take that out and other things. So.
Just recently on Soteriology 101, Leighton Flowers had an author on. I think her name is Dr. Ali Bonner.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to go research or find where her book is at. On Amazon is my usual go-to, and then to find, it's a
like
very
$80 or something.
It was at $105.
Yeah.
And then
and the reason why is, a university will only print, say, 200 copies of the book, hypothetically speaking. So they charge a lot and they do a few prints. So they don't print in bulk as much as one would think.
I thought, okay, well, maybe since it's such like a scholarly book, I can think of like finding this book in a campus, a college campus.
Yeah, a
So
library.
it's more like
Hmm.
a research book, so I can see why it's more expensive. But I just thought, well, what if authors do that? But I wonder if they have the option of making the same book as a popular kind of level. So two books.
Yeah, my goal is to do that. I'd like to write a popular trilogy
Mm-hmm.
on my doctoral research, and it would allow me to also write other things that I couldn't include in
Mm-hmm.
my dissertation, and really be an introduction to the Gallic monks for people.
Mm-hmm.
But also that can take time too, going from an academic way of arguing, writing, word choice
Mm-hmm.
to more lay level,
Yeah,
accessible book.
right.
And so they each have their different purposes, but yeah, that takes a lot of time to do that, to set aside. So yeah.
Yeah, I was going through her book. I got it. I'm like, oh my
Okay.
gosh, I got it.
No,
Um,
I watched an interview with her
mhm,
and Warren McRue,
mhm,
Idol Killer. And so she's done her research on Pelagianism,
mhm.
which I'm also interested in. But my work was on the so-called semi-pelagians.
Oh,
So my
okay.
research was a little different, but very closely related with her research in terms of chronology.
Yeah. So, are we talking about? So your thesis book is going to be about a time a little after her book, for example?
Yes. So yes and no. So John Cassian lived in the first half of the 5th century, so the 400s. And it
Mhm,
was during this same time that the Pelagian heresy was taking root and the debates were occurring.
mhm,
Cassian was off doing his own thing. And um, and so there's some overlap. But then by the time you get to Vincent of Lorraine, he is writing his Commonitorium, his work, in 434 AD, and Augustine passed away in 430.
mhm,
So, and Vincent then also has some other writings, and then later on, I also write on a fellow named Faustus,
mhm,
Faustus of Ries, not Faustus the Manichaean, two different
mhm,
Faustuses. Fausti, what's the plural?
mhm.
So yeah, I do write a little later, and then I also write on the Second Council of Orange, which
Mhm.
occurred in the 6th century.
Okay.
So there are other players there, historical figures that are important to observe and to follow along and try to figure out what's going on here and why are these guys writing this way. And
Right.
so,
So
yeah,
it
that's my,
overlaps. It
there's a little
overlaps quite a
overlap,
bit.
but I go beyond for another 130 years
Okay.
thereafter.
Okay, good, good. So I'll be reading her book and then I'll be reading your book.
Yeah, yeah, her book would be the one to read first, just in terms of chronology.
Okay. And I'm surprised. It is a little challenging to read at times, but you get the overall idea of what she's saying. It's so far it's good, and it's a good introduction for me because um, probably my viewers they might relate to me in that we've never been taught like church history
Yeah,
necessarily. So it's kind of strange. It's a little strange to start just thinking about, well, so there were Christians sometime in history that thought different things about Christianity than what we do. And so it's kind of hard to navigate that sometimes, you
for
know?
sure. Yeah, and there's a lot to be learned from the church fathers. This broad era, the first few centuries. What did the earliest Christians think about Christianity? And sometimes the questions they were dealing with, they were forced to deal with culturally, politically, um, and
Mhm.
sociologically. Those questions were a lot different than the types of questions we deal with today. And sometimes we carry our own hermeneutical baggage, the way we interpret the Bible. We do it from our 21st century lens, and we can be biased. We may not even know it, right? That's the idea of the bias, is that it's a blind spot for us when we're reading the Bible, and we impose our own context into the words. We try to make sense of the words, and that's when we can frequently come to misinterpretation. So sometimes when reading the church fathers, we can help realize, oh, that was a bias or a weakness, a blind spot for me. And it's interesting looking at the text this way. So, of course, that doesn't mean the church fathers were always correct, by no means, but they help us to make us more aware of those blind spots.
They were like us in the sense that they were trying to understand what the authors were writing and how it relates to their time in history.
Yeah, so it's important to recall, like I'd mentioned, we have a way of interpreting the text. We bring our own hermeneutical baggage. And when we look at the doctrine of original sin, we can frequently see how those weaknesses or blind spots get us. Some of us may come from a religious background, and we were raised in a certain type of church. That church had beliefs we may not find ourselves aligning with, or we haven't even thought of. And so when we begin to look at and explore Christian doctrine for ourselves, so we can have a deeper faith, we can understand sometimes from a very neutral way, how did this denomination come to this belief, right? It doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but we can just explore that journey. So there is a development of Christian doctrine. Let me give one fine example here. The doctrine of the Trinity, which is core Christian belief. The word Trinity does not appear in the Bible anywhere, period. But what happens is over the first few centuries, you see the church leaders begin to write about and reflect on what the Bible was presenting. And so you see this development. And so there's nothing wrong per se with doctrine developing. And it's just a matter of if we think that development follows in accordance with what Scripture teaches. So with the Trinity, I'm an Orthodox Christian, Orthodox lowercase o. So I do believe that the Scripture teaches the Trinity. On the doctrine of original sin, it's quite complex because there are a variety of perspectives on this. It is, in some senses, a Orthodox issue. In other senses, it is not. And I'm happy to get into that. And so, but let me just start first with, we've used this term original sin. What does this mean, right? And then I'll explain how there are these different nuances, different views.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Sure, yeah.
Don't forget what you're about to say.
No worries. Yeah, go ahead.
So back in those days, which you're going to tell us all right now, all about that.
I'm going to tell you everything from Christian history in the first 500 years. No,
everything in like 1 to 2 hours.
Yeah.
These people, these fathers that we call them, their Bible study looks a lot different than our Bible study because they didn't have as many, the people in those days didn't have as many resources as we do today. And so we have like these important figures in history because they were the most educated of their time. Is that why we take certain of these figures more seriously? For example, Augustine.
So it's not necessarily that they were the most educated. Some of them were very, very educated, highly educated. Some of them were not. The reason why we would take them seriously was they were the leaders of the church. And so they had the responsibility to care for and pass on the Christian faith and what the Christian faith meant. Okay. And so, of course, they did this, like a pastor would. They would deliver weekly sermons. One of the Greek fathers, John Chrysostom, was a wonderful orator, and he garnered the nickname Golden Tongue for his sermons. Mm-hmm. He was a beloved preacher. And interestingly enough, here in the West, right, we inherit the Western culture. And in the West, we revere Augustine. And some people, almost to the extent that they revere a gospel author or St. Paul. And, I don't view Augustine with that same type of reverence for a number of reasons. One, he admits in many places how he changes his mind. He's uncertain about things. So I think it's fully acceptable to disagree with him on some issues. But it's very little recognized that John Chrysostom's corpus, his written works, rival that of Augustine's, but barely any Protestants talk about or write about John Chrysostom. And that's, that's a weakness. But like I said, we inherit our traditions. So we're from the West. I'm a Protestant, so the Protestant tradition has a large debt of gratitude to Augustine's writings. So especially if you're from the Reformed tradition, not necessarily for other Protestant traditions, but especially for the Reformed. Yeah, so I'm going off on a rabbit trail here again.
No, that's perfect. But I just to try to understand, like,
So the reason why we pay attention to these church fathers is because they were the leaders of the church. They had the keys to the treasure box of Christian doctrine.
So why were they considered leaders as opposed to other people preaching at that time? Was it politically?
These were the people preaching. These are people whose writings have survived through the centuries. So surely there were other preachers whose writings have been lost to history, and we simply don't have them. But these fellows usually held high positions in the church. Some of them held lower positions. Sometimes, for example, the gentleman who would later become a heretic, Arius, he was a presbyter or an elder in his church. So that wasn't the highest position, obviously, of the church in that time period, but it was a respected one. And so he wrote and disagreed with, his what today we might call a pastor. And lo and behold, there's a snowball effect that leads to the Great Council of Nicaea in 325. So, so these are the Christian leaders. They are the preachers. They are the writers. They're the theologians.
Yeah.
They are the Tim Kellers of their day. So
one more. I promise I'm almost
no worries,
done.
yeah.
2 more questions, just to give us, for the people that are not aware of like what's going on in church history.
Sure.
There's a dynamic also that we should be aware of, that it's been a slow progress for women to have to be seen as not just limited in one role. So so it's only recent times that women have been able to, well, we've developed a more egalitarian view just in our culture. So back in these days that we're talking about, that's why the men were holding the main, they were the teachers, right? Predominantly during this time, because would you say that a lot of women were not did not have as much access to this information, because there's also languages involved and things like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair, I haven't looked at the issue in depth as I have, Original Sin. But I think that's a common point that's made. Why aren't there church mothers? Why are these the church fathers? And we simply, if there had been writings from women, they wouldn't have survived, I guess. So they haven't survived, just as a matter of fact. Very little, perhaps some letters maybe, but nothing of the extent of, Augustine's City of God or other works.
Gotcha.
So it's and even to this day, theology is predominantly a male industry. And although it's nice to see more women becoming interested in it, and it's growing and becoming more acceptable for women to have roles in ministry, formally speaking. So but we don't want to get too far off the beaten path, because I'm no expert on that subject matter.
And then the last thing, so there's also one more dynamic going on with, you mentioned there are politics involved, but there's something happening having to do with the church leaders have rights somehow to label someone a heretic, and so is that something you're going to be discussing, or should we talk about that a little bit right now?
I mean, I could talk about that briefly. What makes someone a heretic? Heresy is basically a way of just saying, hey, that's not what we believe. And orthodoxy is, rightly ordered belief, a right belief. And so when church councils would come together and form and convene, sometimes this would happen over the matter of weeks or months. And these leaders would discuss and debate. Sometimes it would get heated, what it is that we've believed. And they would even debate a single letter, like an I in a Greek word, and the impact that single letter would have, because it means something. For example, homoousios or homoiousios. There's a difference in meaning between those two Greek words. So when we carve out the boundaries of what is it that Christians believe, if someone were to come along and say something that is contrary to that, we'd say, oh, well, that's heresy. And so someone would be formally ruled a heretic if they had been informed of what the right belief is and refused to recant their beliefs. So they would be excommunicated from the church. So that's sort of how we get heretics. And especially these days in Protestantism, we throw that around loosely, and rarely is it that people are formally excommunicated from churches. Typically in our consumerist society, we just leave and go to another church.
Right. Okay, so a lot that I could ask about that, but we should really get back to the topic. So go
Sure. So
ahead and tell us.
yeah, so for original sin, it's this term, what do we mean? And of course, there's one sense of what original sin means: the original sin, the sin that Adam and Eve committed. That's sort of the chronological original sin. But frequently when we use this term original sin, we mean it in the sense of what Adam has passed on to his posterity, or even in more common language, what are the effects of the fall? And so what is it that we humans have inherited from our ancestors? And so there's a debate, sometimes a raging debate, it depends on the issue, over what it is that we've inherited precisely. And we have these debates between Calvinists, Arminians, and others. And this debate has also been had within the church fathers. So, for example, it's frequently attributed to Pelagius or Pelagianism, and whether that remains to be true is a question we'll let Ali Bonner deal with, and maybe others. But it's usually claimed that Pelagius denied that the fall had any effect upon human nature, and rather that we are created just like Adam and Eve, in the sense that we have this neutral slate, if you will. And so that's the claim anyway. And there's debate over whether Pelagius meant it in an analogical sense, which is basically saying when we sin like Adam. And we see that analogical sense in the Greek fathers for sure, most definitely. And you see it very slightly in the in the Latin pre-Augustinian tradition. But maybe he meant it something more akin to what it's claimed he meant. So there's a debate over that. Other issues that within the Christian tradition it's been debated: do we, and this is a big one, do we inherit the very guilt of Adam? And you're like, well, why is that an important question? It seems like such a nitpicky thing. Well, I mean, when you begin to think about what happens to infants that die, are they guilty? Will they go to hell because they have the very guilt of Adam? And so there are different takes, of course, on this, and we can get into that. And in the Christian tradition, so one of the things I looked at in my doctoral research was tracing that subtenet of original sin. So I wanted to trace a number of what I call a subtenet, a sub-belief, because original sin, is a doctrine of sub-doctrines, really. And so I'm happy to affirm original sin, but the question is, what do I mean? What is it when I affirm we have original sin? Well, so my own personal beliefs, and my own beliefs are different from, say, the historical work that I've done. Of course, there are people that I read and disagreed with, but I think that we inherit mortality. We all die. We inherit a propensity to sin. There's a tendency for us to sin. I affirm the corruption of human nature, so that Adam's sin drastically affected human nature. Now, there's debates over what that looks like. Was it a corruption of DNA? Was it a metaphysical corruption? What is it? What does this look like? So yeah, and I affirm other things as well, that now, man and God are separated, and humans are unable to save themselves. And so there's a need for a savior, right? So I believe in the necessity of the atonement. But there are some things that I do not believe. And so one of the things I do not believe is that we inherit the very guilt of Adam. I also deny that humans are unable to do any objective good apart from what I call super added grace. So this is a position that separates me from Calvinists and Arminians. And you mentioned latent flowers. I don't consider myself a provisionist for a number of reasons, but he and I see eye to eye on a number of issues. And I think I was holding my beliefs when he was still a Calvinist, quite possibly. So I know he's sort of made a name for himself as that provisionist guy with his online following. But I like to say, even though I was a youngster, he was still a Calvinist at the time. But
What would you call yourself or label yourself?
Really, I don't have a label. And I think that it's kind of fun that way, because I had this debate with Douglas Wilson over a year ago, and it was on the Gospel Truth channel, which is a Reformed debate. Marlon Wilson, he's a Reformed guy. So a lot of the followers, and I knew this would be the case, they were Reformed, which I'm not. And I think they just had trouble putting me in a box. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be very helpful. The fact that I can't, I don't identify with a particular position. I'm in some ways, I'm sympathetic on some issues to the Gallic monks that I've studied, these 5th century monks. But in other ways, I think they, for example, they held to individual election, that God has pre-chosen which individuals to be saved and which ones not to be saved based on foreknowledge. So that's a very Arminian, classical Arminian position. And I deny that. I hold to the priority of corporate election. So I deny the priority of individual election. Sorry if I'm really nuancing these things, but it's highly important when we get into these nitty-gritty debates. So yeah, I don't mean to say I deny individual election. Of course I affirm it. It's just how I affirm it.
Yes,
so
I get you. So I know I've asked Warren McGrew this, and he labels himself I'm sorry if I'm gonna get this wrong, Warren, but something like pre-Augustinian Orthodox, I think. Would that fit you a tiny bit? Although we're not going to label you.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what he's doing there. I think that label is too broad. That use of the label doesn't actually tell me what he believes. Right. It just tells me what he's not. Yeah. So the question is, what's the functional use of labels? And when I say the term Arminianism or Calvinism, those labels have meaning. Even the term provisionist, has meaning now. So, but yeah, pre-Augustinian, I think it's just probably too broad. And sometimes, because of the development of Christian doctrine, the beliefs that we hold get lost and aren't. So, for example, I think election is one of these issues. And so I think that the doctrine that's accurately described in Scripture, the views of Paul and the biblical authors, it gets lost in translation through cultural change within 200 some years. So it's sometimes not as simple as just a broad label.
Yeah. Are you a follower of Jesus? Christian?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Is that a good
exactly.
label?
Exactly. Okay. Sometimes it's better just to not take a label other than, follower of Jesus. And Paul, of course, writes about why that is in his letter to the Corinthians. So
right. Okay. I love that you talked about why it's a relevant thing for us to discuss. I wanted to share a little bit too. As a Bible student and as a parent, I feel the topic of original sin is very relevant for us to study more in depth because it shows up in our daily life. For example, for my in my life, while I was reading a book about Christianity to my little ones, um, or when I'm like at church Sunday morning and I'm listening to a pastor in many churches, this is the case. So, my first example, I was reading a book, Love Gave, and I came across this line, which kind of left me thinking, because I've been starting to learn more about soteriology and that kind of topic. So it read, "Our greatest grandparents, Adam and Eve, walked away from God in the Garden of Eden, and since then, we're all born with a seed of sin in our hearts." And for my little, I think she was 7 years old at the time. She's still 7, but she just kind of thought, oh no, I don't want to have a seed of sin in my heart, So that was kind of a thing where I'm like, okay, we have to have a conversation about this, maybe this is just one way that some Christians think about this.
And that, to be honest, that's a very moderate or modest way of thinking about it. I mean, if you read other authors, they will say that to say it's merely or only a seed of sin does what they would say is a grave injustice to biblical teaching about the depravity of man. So yeah, but your point stands that it's very applicable in how we teach children about human nature from what we believe the Bible teaches about human nature.
Right, and it was enough for her to understand, oh, there's something wrong with me. It was enough for her to understand, oh no, there's something inside of me.
Yeah.
So it's relevant when we read children's books. And also, for example, it's really common for church pastors to say something like, Adam was the representative of humanity, and because of his disobedience, we have all fallen into sin and we have all inherited a sinful nature.
Yeah, that idea of representative, that's called the federal headship view. And so you see that in Reformed circles, so Calvinist circles, that would reject Augustine's position, or at least one of Augustine's position on that. So yeah, the federal headship view, Adam as representative. So therefore, we are guilty of Adam's sin in that respect, including unborn babies being guilty.
Yeah, so everybody has a sinful nature when you're born. So that's kind of what you hear, from pastors and people that go to church. I mean, we'll just take it as okay because these people that we respect and we appreciate so much, we value them. These pastors, they have studied more than us, so we kind of just take their word for it. But when
Sure.
you start to listen to the debate and you start to learn a little bit more about church history, then when you hear something like, sinful nature, you start to like get a little red flag. Oh, that must come from somewhere. That doctrine comes from somewhere. So,
Yeah, well, and pastors, sometimes they can be imprecise with their language. Pastors will say we have a sin nature. Well, okay, we don't have two natures. We have one nature, and that's human nature. But it's sinful, human nature, right? It's human nature that we have. We don't have sin nature. Sin is, many hold, a privation of the good. So we don't actually have a substance called sin. There is no substance of sin. And so, yeah, again, pastors can be imprecise with their language. And that's important because laypersons then can come away with thinking these incorrect positions that Christian theologians throughout the centuries have never really ever held. So it can lead to misconceptions out there in the Christian community. So in that respect, pastors, in many respects, they're trying to do their best, but sometimes they could do better, like all of us.
right. So let's ask you these two questions briefly that have to do with, since we're talking about the Bible aspect of this topic to start. So D. Jack 116 is asking, based on Romans 5, what spread to all men as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve? Adam's guilt or death?
Oh, well, I mean, I would say that more things spread than just those two options. So the two options given by your follower there, were guilt or death,
Mhm,
and based on Romans 5,
mhm.
I think we can say that more spread to humanity. But yeah, it's I don't think Paul means guilt there, just that death spread to all men. And he brings up Romans 5 because in Augustine's writings, there was a mistranslation from Romans 5:12. And this is from a bad Latin translation from the Greek text. Scholars widely agree that this is a bad translation. It's the older Latin. It was first discovered by Erasmus around the time of the Reformation. And so it's interesting to see how someone, for example, like Thomas Aquinas deals with the text, because he was reading the Latin and he still came to the right conclusions, even though he had the wrong translation. So, and the translation is in whom or because, in whom all sinned or because all have sinned. So, yeah, so you see in other authors who predate Augustine, one fellow, his name is Ambrosiaster, more literally translated would be Ambrose, so not the same Ambrose, but Ambrosiaster. He has this mistranslation as well. He doesn't know it, but he does not propose that we have the very guilt of Adam. So you'll see in the Latin pre-Augustinian tradition, so this is the tradition that Augustine inherited, you'll see some authors make some comments, but never a full, comprehensive, robust, formulaic doctrine of original sin, as you would see in Augustine's writings. In many respects, he took authors from his own tradition, which very much is North African, and he collated them together. And sometimes he didn't understand the author originally. He took the author out of context. And you can look at this, you can investigate this. And he formed his view. So, I wouldn't say that Augustine invented the doctrine of original sin. Sometimes you see that thrown around, especially on the internet. That's not fair to the way it really happened. But he certainly put some views on steroids, we'll say, and took some authors from his own tradition out of context. And mind you, his tradition. So in my chapter on Augustine, there are four main players in that small tradition. But you look at the Greek theological tradition on the subject matter, and I mean, you're talking orders of magnitude of authors who would have disagreed with Augustine's view of original sin. I mean, in some respects, explicitly, if you were to get into the sub-doctrines. So, for example, the idea of inheriting the very guilt of Adam. You can find authors in the Greek theological tradition that are explicit that people are responsible only for their own sin, that infants are innocent, that they are not guilty. So you can find these explicit contradictions in terms of the debates over that idea of inheriting the guilt of Adam. So, but it takes time and research. But so it's interesting, you see, if we're counting coins, or counting heads, theology is not a counting heads sort of field. But if you do survey it like that, you say, oh, well, there's a larger tradition that holds to this position. So that's what I mean when we can find more names defending the innocence of infants than we can find saying that infants are guilty of the very sin of Adam. So
Would it be kind of a fallacy to approach church history that way, that just to believe something because most people believe that?
So, right. So there are 2 points I want to make here. Yeah, you don't want to believe something just because others have believed it. So that doesn't make something true, we should say. Just because people have believed it doesn't make it true. Okay. So we very well could believe something that the tradition has not believed. All right. But as a matter of orthodoxy, what is it? And orthodoxy, we'll say broad orthodoxy. What is it that the church has believed? So Vincent of Lorenz, one of the 5th century monks that I studied, he wrote a work called the Commonitorium. And he basically has this query. He says, well, there are just as many interpretations as there are interpreters. So how do we know what's right? Mm-hmm. And so scholars call this the Vincentian canon, that Christians, as Vincent details it, that we Christians believe what has been believed everywhere, always, by all. Mm. So there's this measure of faith, a rule of faith. And so in that respect, if we look at the tradition, overall Christian history, the development of doctrine, mm-hmm. and we realize that, hypothetically speaking in this example, that Calvinism, let's say 5-point Calvinism, is but a sliver of what Christians have believed always, everywhere, by all. And so I think this is important for certainly at least intellectual humility from everyone, because sometimes you can be dealing with people who are adamant that it's this way, it's always been this way. But wait a second, that's not what we have always believed everywhere, by all. And so it's sort of like, it provides a filter, if you will, to help us in our conversations. Mm-hmm. I know we're getting off track here again, but
one more thing. Let's do a little off track for just one more minute. The apologetics mind kicks in when you mentioned that Thomas Aquinas was able to get something right, even though his translation was off in that one part. And I can hear someone saying, well, how can we trust, that these fathers were correct if maybe their translations were not as good as what we have now? But it seems that we can know, like you just said, we know what he had and we know what he believed, and so we are aware of those things. Would you say that?
Yeah, so the reason why I say that is because, well, certainly I say that because I think he got it right, and there are going to be other Christians who think he got it wrong. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the way he reasoned theologically and philosophically, he came to the right, accurate conclusions. But he had the mistranslation of Romans 5:12, and he still dealt with the doctrine in the way that I would have dealt with the doctrine. There are times when, like with Augustine, he has the mistranslation and he deals with the doctrine theologically in a way I would not have dealt with theologically. Augustine believed he had the Catholic view, and by Catholic I mean universal here, because this is before the Great Schism. So there is no Roman Catholic versus Eastern Orthodox. There's just everybody. And so he argues this way in a number of writings, that he holds to the view of the Catholic Church on original sin. But he cites one guy named Cyprian more than anybody else, and then he also cites Ambrose. So he only cites 2 authors predominantly. And the Catholic Church, universal, is way more complex and broad than just those 2 guys. And Augustine was not the best at reading Greek. In fact, he had to depend upon contemporary Latin translations of Greek works by John Chrysostom. You can see this in his correspondence, his unfinished work in answer to Julian, who was a Pelagian, where he admits this, and they're debating over what John Chrysostom meant, and it's really fascinating. But because he says he depends on a Latin work, I mean, you're kind of like, well, okay, so you're not even reading John Chrysostom in the Greek, which, that's fair. We don't all learn Greek. But the point is that he is missing out on a robust theological tradition, which it's a blind spot for him, because he thinks his view is the view of the Catholic Church, and it's not. Really, it's not. You can analyze that claim as a historical claim. Again, that's not to say he held the actual wrong views about biblical interpretation. So logically speaking, you could be a content Calvinist. This is a historical question, right, that we can investigate. I happen to not be a Calvinist, so I'm all the more passionate about the historical investigations and showing why this guy really was mistaken. He held these blind spots, and we can look over that. So you're going to get that regardless of the camps. You're going to get Reformed historical theologians and the like. But yeah. So what's interesting about my research studying these Gallic monks is that rarely do you find Reformed theologians who have actually read the primary sources and who continue to hold the historical conclusions that Calvinists will spout about the semi-Pelagians as heretics, or, they'll use semi-Pelagian as an insult. Of course, that's a label the Gallic monks never really would have held. And they wrote explicitly against Pelagius. All three of them, the three guys that I studied, the three largest guys that we would consider semi-Pelagian, they would never use the label. That's why I call them the Gallic monks. And I sometimes only use semi-Pelagian as a accommodation language, if you will, to the existing debate. But yeah, I think we should opt for a different label, like Gallic monks and Gallic theology. So this is not to be confused with Gaelic, right? Gaelic. That's, Celtic theology. Think England, Wales, and Scotland, and all that. So, okay, yeah, I'm going off again, but I know you've got more questions, so I'm happy to entertain what I can.
One more, and then we can move on to the part where you give us your survey.
Sure.
But before I ask that one, you mentioned the schism, and I often, in my circle of like apologetics, our book club, or just friends, Christian friends, we are always kind of at a loss with what happened in that. And I know it's too much to go into right now, but is there like a very simple way to explain what happened from the time of the Bible authors to like the time or of Augustine, like there was something having to do with the Catholic Church, like what happened? Like just briefly.
Yeah, I'll give a very simplistic explanation. And in 1050 AD, the church split, the Great Divide between the East and the West. And a large factor, there are many factors that went into this, but a large factor was the question of where the capital of Christendom should be. Which bishop was the highest authority? Was it in Rome or was it Constantinople? And that was a large debate. At a certain point prior to the Great Divide, there were claims of two guys competing to have the sole, the sole exclusive highest authority. So there are many other issues. For example, the filioque clause that was added into the Nicene Creed by the West. This was not formally approved by an ecumenical council, and the West added this phrase that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, filio Son, the filioque clause, that was added into the Nicene Creed. So if you ever see that creed and you're in a Protestant church and you say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, well, when you say that, that was a cause of division between the East and the West. So yeah, that's another issue. There are even more. Yeah, we just don't have time to get into that.
Okay. That was 1050 though, right? So what happened before Augustine?
Well, you mean after Augustine? I mean, there are ecumenical councils. There's socio-political issues at stake over the following 500 plus years. There are other ecumenical councils that take place.
Okay.
Protestants typically don't recognize some of these councils. For example, one that took place at the end of the iconoclast controversy. So is it, what does it mean to venerate icons?
Right.
And Protestants are like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, exactly, because we we don't even recognize, one of those later ecumenical councils.
But is this more of the content of, for example, the Catholic Church? They take those very seriously, and then it wasn't until like Martin Luther that Protestantism happened, and we identify more with that form of Christianity as opposed to this earlier.
Right, right. So Protestants, the Protestant Reformation, 1517, um, we we affirm the first four ecumenical councils,
Okay.
but Protestants, generally speaking, think that the councils thereafter uh, are no longer relevant, don't apply. We recognize the first four ecumenical councils only because they align with what we think Scripture teaches, right? So
Okay.
Protestants hold to sola scriptura, Scripture as the final authority on the matters it addresses.
Mhm.
And this position is in conflict with the position of the Roman Catholic Church, from whence Protestantism comes. And it's in conflict because the Roman Catholic Church believes that Scripture and church tradition, the authority of the Pope, are on equal footing.
Mhm.
So that's a problem for us Protestants. So
Okay.
yeah, so we only affirm the first four ecumenical councils because we think, hey, it aligns. Now, some of us Protestants might think some of these other later councils also are good and fine and dandy, but generally speaking, there's not universal agreement.
Okay, so that's the time period that you're about to talk to us about? That's kind of like what the Christian world looks like, where
Well, some of these councils took place in the latter centuries of the first millennium, so 700, 800, 900 AD. And the time period I looked at was about 410 AD up to 530. So I've got 120 years within the scope of my study.
okay. So let me just ask this last
I know we're
question.
getting really heavy here. If it's too deep, just let me know and I can back off.
Not at all. So I'll ask you this question and then you can start. And then after you give us your presentation, then we'll just do the Q&A. So PMA Master, he asked for the definition of original sin, which you already have provided for us, but he also wanted to know what are the implications of that. And you have gone over a lot of them. Did you have any others you wanted to add?
Uh, sure. Yeah, I could add some in terms of the implications, right? I've already talked about my personal beliefs in the necessity of the atonement, for example. If humans are separated from God, then we are unable to save ourselves. And so we need something else. We need a mediator, right? The God man, as Anselm's Crudeus Homo, that work that he wrote on the necessity of the atonement. So yeah, I believe those things. There are other implications of the doctrine of original sin. For example, I'd mentioned, what happens to infants when they die. Do they go to hell? Do they go to heaven? If you're Roman Catholic, do they go to limbo? But in terms of how pastors counsel parents in their grief, we should have a philosophy or a theology of how we counsel people in grief. And our advice to grieving parents should align with our theology. So when you get people who offer counsel that is not aligned with their theology, something has gone awry because certain truths are uncomfortable to hear. I mean, there's a way of communicating truth in a loving way. And so I think this is, I've got a working theory out there, and I'm probably going to catch some flack for this, but that's all right. So we're seeing a lot of deconversion stories, a lot of them. With the internet, it's becoming more culturally acceptable. And I'm recognizing a trend. Again, I haven't done a formal academic survey, but I'm recognizing a trend based on when I'm reading these stories that come out. And it's frequently the case that many of these deconversion stories are coming from a Reformed background. These are people who were born and raised in a Calvinist Reformed tradition, theological tradition. So their understanding of God's sovereignty, predestination, whatnot, all flows from certain beliefs, and I think that's being largely rejected. Now, I'm not saying, even 80% of these deconversion cases are from Reformed, backgrounds. But if it were, say, 30 or 40%, that should still be alarming, because Calvinists make up a sliver of Christendom, and they make up a minority of Protestantism. So for them to make up a strong minority or a majority of these deconversion, right, it's disproportional. You recognize it's, so something's going on here. And I think a survey like that should be beneficial even to Reformed traditions, to say, hey, we're doing something wrong here. What are we doing wrong? So yeah.
And I think
So
that applies for any, not just Reform, right? We should want to
that's right.
get
Yeah. So we need
feedback.
to do more surveys on the backgrounds. What are leading people to their beliefs in God? What is it leading them to?
Yeah.
So getting back to the question about implications for original sin, right? This doctrine has a connective tissue between other beliefs that we hold. So we might think, for example, if we affirm this sense of total inability, that humans are unable to do anything that's objectively good, that's going to lead us to, require or necessitate a sense of super added grace. And then there are different camps on what that looks like. Is it God's prevenient grace? Is it regenerative grace? Prevenient grace coming from an Arminian or Wesleyan background, regenerative grace. There are differences here in these senses of grace. So yeah, what we think about original sin can inform what we believe about other Christian doctrines.
Yeah, it seems to, so you have original sin, and then that leads to like theology solutions, other doctrines. So let's go ahead and move on to the next part of our discussion. And we can start by, you can answer Jordan Thornburg's question. What is the basic history of the doctrine within the church, the doctrine of original sin, and where did it first start?
Yeah, great question. I'm just laughing because I wrote multiple chapters on this. So like, yeah, give me a basic history is like, I mean, where, how to build a house. There are just so many factors that go into it. So I surveyed the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition. And in many senses, I was keeping an eye and an ear out for statements about original sin. What do I mean by that? Sometimes a Christian author would talk explicitly about the effects of the fall. Okay. So they might talk about guilt or innocence. They might say that faith comes from the person. Well, that would be a case of when they don't explicitly talk about the fall. So what did a church father believe about free will, for example? So that's a related issue to original sin, but it helps us to inform what they believe about original sin. Because like I'd mentioned, what we think about original sin has implications or effects, these sub-doctrines. It both affects and effects, right? It affects what we think about these, and that is the effect. So if we could find in the church fathers statements indicating what they believed about human free will, for example, we can sort of work backwards and infer what they would have believed about original sin. So I did as best as I could both and here. So I searched both for explicit remarks about the fall, even discovering, who was the first church father to use the fall. And if you're wondering, that's Methodius of Olympus. What a name that is in the Greek tradition. He's the first guy to refer to it in this formal sense, the fall. And he lived in the second half of the 3rd century. And yeah, it's such a great name, Methodius of Olympus. So I did this survey, and I first wrote on the historical backgrounds of the Augustinian Pelagian controversy. And I did this because this is frequently where our debates on Calvinism and Arminianism begin as well, in this historical debate. And so I wanted to provide the historical background to that, because that leads up to the Gallic monks. And we could see how the church dealt with that issue. But then later on, there are monks from Hadramata in North Africa who had these concerns with Augustine's writings. And so he wrote some works that we have. Some of his last works were written to these monks. And so it's there that we see some of his views on predestination and really, and on perseverance. Rebuke and Grace is one of the last ones, where these really come out more so than in any time in his writings. And, you know, there's a shift in Augustine that occurs in his thinking. He admits this explicitly. And so, you know, if people, getting back to Warren McGrew and his comment, if he told people that he's an early Augustinian, you know, I would agree with him on that. And that's maybe more accurate than just a broad label. Okay, but getting back on here. So these monks, you don't hear, these monks from Hadramata, you don't hear from them again. But you do hear from this fellow named Prosper of Aquitaine. And this is also Roman Gaul. And he's a layperson. And he says, hey, there are these church leaders here. You know, this is Prosper. I'm really trying to defend you. I'm paraphrasing here. I'm really trying to defend you, but these church leaders are using your works against me. They're using your works against you. And, you know, help me out here. And so so Augustine writes back to Prosper, and Prosper's talking about the Gallic monks. He's extremely likely talking about John Cassian. I say extremely likely because he doesn't mention him by name. He mentions his views. And we also know that Prosper wrote a work later on called Against the Conferencer. And John Cassian wrote the Conferences. Okay, so, but in this letter to Augustine, he doesn't mention Cassian by name. So it's just extremely likely, without a doubt, he's talking about John Cassian. And Augustine's letter's great. He writes on the predestination of the saints. And I say it's great because you read chapter 2 of it, and he talks about how these brothers, these Christian brothers, yes, they're mistaken on predestination, but they deny Pelagianism and they are Orthodox. And you're like, well, wait a second, if only Calvinists would actually read Augustine's writings, they would actually not hold to such vitriolic views against what John Cassian believed. And so I like to cite that out when I'm talking to Calvinists, because they haven't read the primary, generally speaking, they haven't read the primary sources. I have to qualify it because, of course, there might be one or two, you know, a few people that have. But generally speaking, they haven't. And it's very important to read the primary sources if we understand what people meant and held, the beliefs they held. So he writes this work, Augustine does. And so, you know, I looked at his writings and provided, you know, what I thought were his views of original sin. And I go, you know, fairly deep into this. And then one of the last sections of my chapter on Augustine, as I had mentioned earlier, is that he believed his view was the view of the Catholic Church at that time. So as a matter of historical investigation, let's look at what Latin sources we have, and we can analyze two things. One, the way in which Augustine quotes and cites church authorities on this issue. I had mentioned two of them, the two predominant ones, Cyprian and Ambrose. But secondly, whether that Latin tradition really does line up with what Augustine's claiming. And I'll say that it's suspect. I won't say that it doesn't, but it's suspect in many cases. So he misinterprets some of the authors from his own tradition, and he adds things that aren't there. Again, you can't say that he invented the doctrine of original sin. That's inaccurate. But he certainly adds things that others within his own tradition would not have said. So I do that. And then I move into the largest chapter of my book is on the Greek theological tradition, because there are so many more authors on this subject matter that have written on this or related issues, theological issues from which we can infer. You know, for example, Athanasius the famous great Athanasius from the 4th century. He doesn't write explicitly on these issues, but you can make inferences from what he believed about human nature. So because original sin is about the effects of the fall and what human nature is like now, you can, again, infer what someone thinks about human nature and work backward. And that's, in this case, that's warranted to do that if the inferences are made appropriately and accordingly. So the Greek theological tradition is robust, and scholars widely agree. They denied the sense that we inherit the very guilt of Adam. They denied that humans are unable to do any objective good. They thought that, that people could perform a good action. Of course, that doesn't mean that you merit salvation just because you can do a good act. So there's a distinction to be had there. But it's interesting, some of the debates that they were having was on baptism and infant baptism. This is in the early days. For example, Tertullian, this is in the West, in the Latin West. Tertullian denied that infants needed to be baptized. So that's fascinating, because later on the tradition changes and they say, no, they do need to be baptized. And so there's this act of infant baptism, and this is in related to Augustine. I know I'm kind of bouncing around here. In related to Augustine, he came to believe in part that because there's a church practice, there should be a doctrine that informs the practice. So there had been a pre-existing liturgical practice which had no formal theological doctrine supporting it. And so in many cases, some have reasons. This is not just me. For example, Tatha Wiley, she's got a book there. I know I'm turning away. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I've got it on my shelf somewhere here. Tatha Wiley is a scholar. She basically says that Augustine works backwards here. He reasons backwards. Now, whether that's justifiable or not, of course, is a different debate. So my survey on the Greek theological tradition recognized a broad tradition that was very much in contrast to the doctrine that Augustine presented. So the question is, why would I do this survey between the East and the West? Well, then I moved to study the Gallic monks, and I wrote a chapter on John Cassian, one chapter on Vincent of Lérins, and one chapter on Faustus of Fries. And I was able to analyze their respective views and to see how their views align far more closely with the Greek theological tradition, even though they wrote in the Latin West. This should not be surprising when you study a biography or two of John Cassian. He had lived in the East. He studied under the Egyptian desert fathers. He was ordained by John Chrysostom. There are other hints and clues of Greek theological views. For example, views of Origen, and so even though he established monasteries in the West, John Chrysostom, his views were very Eastern. So this is important because it's frequently claimed that semi-Pelagianism sought to build a bridge between Augustinianism and Pelagianism. So it was this ad hoc creation between the two camps. No, that is not true as a matter of historical investigation. The so-called semi-Pelagians, which is a label they never would have accepted, brought over the Greek theological tradition to the West. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. So I think that's very important for our contemporary discussions, not only as a matter of historical claims about what is semi-Pelagianism, but when fellows like Leighton Flowers are getting blasted for heresy, his views on the nature of man are going to align with, and I take it he'd be highly sympathetic to, the Greek theological tradition on the nature of man and original sin. And I don't have a problem with that, and I don't think others should either. Yeah, so it's obvious that his views are not new. They're not novel. They're not even heterodox. Heterodox would be saying, it's a lesser term than heretics, heresy. So I think that's why, when I've studied these Gallic monks, this work was highly important, and it has implications for our contemporary discussions that we're having on soteriology. It's quite relevant because a lot of these ad hominems, these attacks, these straw men are made, the claims are made, and they simply don't stand up to scrutiny. And so that was my, what we'll say is my secondary motivation. And I mentioned this explicitly in my opening chapter. This was a secondary motivation to really address these misconceptions. And of course, if my motivation turned out wrong, then I would have corrected it. But I had done my master's thesis studying these guys, so I already kind of knew it heads up, where the data pointed. And the doctoral thesis just, basically allowed me to go crazy in depth on it, whereas a master's thesis hadn't. So that's sort of my research in a nutshell. I know I'm not going super deep, and the way I interpret Vincent of Lorenz is debatable, by which I mean that there are some scholars that hold different views on Vincent of Lorenz, and it depends on how you interpret and understand some of his writings, specifically a writing that was discovered in 1938. So there's debates, but I've looked into it and it's been enjoyable, and I'm happy to put up a good fight against people that disagree with me on this. But by and large, the scholars that study the Gallic monks and have read the primary sources think these guys get a bad reputation in theology. And so that's a motivation for me, regardless if someone agrees with my interpretation of Vincent and his view of original sin. These guys deserve better. These Gallic monks, they deserve better than the way Protestants have treated them. I think Cassian is one of the most underrated theologians in the Western tradition, period. He's the only one. Get this, Cassian is the only Western author to write against Nestorianism. Nestorianism is the idea that there are two persons in Jesus Christ. There's the Logos, and then there's the human, right? So this is an Orthodox heresy, right? 431, Ephesus. He's deemed, his views are deemed heretical. This is also confirmed at the Council of Chalcedon, So Cassian, no one talks about it though. It's really a fascinating point. And what makes it even better is that this work that he writes against Nestorianism, he says Nestorius makes the same error as the heretic Pelagius, and he goes into describing why. So John Cassian is explicitly writing against Pelagianism. And but no one talks about that. It's because no one reads him. And because he's deemed a semi-Pelagian, they just ignore him. So yeah, it's really an insult to him to call him a semi-Pelagian. And again, people need to read the primary sources. And someone just on Twitter, if I may, Susan, let me look this up because I just responded to this today.
Oh, good.
I was notified of this here. Yes. So Dr. Jordan B. Cooper, he wrote this. So the provisionists are not only flirting with Pelagianism, but now are openly questioning the two natures of Christ. Oof. And again, anti-creedalism falls into heresy. So again, I'm not a provisionist. I don't identify with that for a number of reasons. But I wrote back to him and I said, Dr. Cooper, from one doctorate to another, kindly read Cassian's De Incarnatione, the only Western work from that era against Nestorianism. It's obviously that he hasn't. Yeah. And, I'm saying that because there's a connection between what John Cassian believed and what the provisionists today also believe. Mm-hmm. And so, for someone such as Jordan Cooper, I don't know him personally, for him to say that, mm-hmm. Really, again, I think is historically ignorant and uncharitable.
Yeah. I've also been looking on Twitter to similar things and starting to read this book by Ali Bonner. I'm just starting to realize how many people, how many Christians, they're well-meaning, right? But they might not be aware of how wrong they might be on a lot of these
Oh
things,
yeah.
and how harsh they come across to people that, because like you're saying, if you're not reading the primary sources, then you're reading like secondary sources, I guess. You're reading other people talking about those guys.
Sometimes tertiary sources.
Right.
So what do we mean? This would be someone today who
Mhm.
reads a reformed systematic theologian who devotes 2 paragraphs to talking about the semi-pelagians, and doing so from the lens of Prosper of Aquitaine. So if you want to get John Cassian's view,
Mhm.
you go through Prosper, who is his opponent, and so there's
Mhm.
no guarantee that what he's going to say is accurate. So to get Cassian's view, you go through his opponent, through a systematic theologian who lived 200 years ago to today. So
Yeah.
there's this, you're reading a tertiary source
Yeah.
when you've got a secondary source, but you should read the primary source. And we have it. So we can compare with how the primary source deals, the secondary source deals with the primary source. And then we can see how the systematic theologian did in describing these guys.
Mhm.
Newsflash: the systematic theologians did a bad job. Uh,
Yeah.
and and
Yeah.
I'm a historical systematic theologian, so I can see
Yeah.
that.
No, it's because of that reliance that we have, because like we'll trust a Bible teacher,
Yeah,
often someone online, perhaps, if not your actual pastor, right? And you just kind of take their word for it, and it's one of those
yeah,
things where we
yeah.
don't
So
know
the
how wrong
encouragement
they
is
are.
simply for people to look into this issue.
Yeah.
And I think Allie Bonner's doing the same sort of thing. She's encouraging people to look into the issue, and I haven't had time to look into that issue, but I'm happy to grant, for the sake of the debate,
Hmm.
in principle, what she's saying,
Hmm.
because I can confirm that that's exactly what's happened with my guys that I've studied.
Hmm.
So I'm sympathetic to that concern that a monk from the 5th century has been strawmanned. That's Bonner's concern.
Yeah.
That's my concern. So we share
Yeah.
sympathies there.
And also goes back to how you just did that that video series on Bart Ehrman,
Yeah.
because you want to go back to his actual words and make sure that Christian apologists are not giving the wrong interpretation.
Yeah, yeah. And if you want to have effective communication, you have to understand what your opponent is saying.
Mhm.
Uh, so, what is our opponent saying? That's the
Mhm.
first thing you have to do before you can realize, like, do I agree with that or not? You have to know what they're saying. And so, if we get that wrong, then we're going to get the other things wrong.
Yeah, and as someone that doesn't do, well, hasn't gone to like seminary like you have and gone really deep into the studying, I can relate to a lot of these people online that are just kind of sharing things on Twitter. But there is this sense of like a fear of learning the wrong theology, or
Yeah.
anger that other Christians are teaching wrong. And there was like this. Before I had heard about Pelagius, uh, just my whole Christian life, I never had heard about that until I started listening to some of these people online. And then I decided to go start reading one of his letters. And it's so amazing to just kind of read it, and just you kind of get a different feel for the person versus what other.
Yeah, they're a human.
Yeah, yeah. They're
They're human, and
polite.
especially Pelagius. He wanted to pursue a holy life.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not like this guy was trying to destroy the church.
Yeah.
And that's the depiction or description you may receive from someone who, you know, is trying to
Yeah.
protect their own brand
Yeah.
of Christianity, by
Yeah.
which I mean their own denomination or beliefs.
Yeah.
So
And this is not to say that I agree with everything, right? It's just interesting, and it's a challenge for us to actually go to the sources ourselves, and it'll be very revealing about the people that we're listening to. It'll help us to see if those people are exaggerating or using a lot of
yep,
rhetoric. So how about we start with our Q&A
sure,
questions?
yeah.
Okay, so Noel and Liva, he had already asked a question before, but he has three questions, so just to keep that in mind. How is the teaching on original sin different when comparing the Alexandrian desert fathers, Gauls, monks, and priests, and Greek Eastern fathers on the one hand, with the Alexandrian Western fathers and Rome on the other?
Yeah, now I've already sort of addressed that quite a bit, comparing and contrasting. So let me use that to talk about where they were agreed. How about that? So where they've differed, I've mentioned the inheritance of guilt and inability. There's a strong difference there. There's universal agreement that as a result of Adam's sin, we all physically die. So mortality is passed on. And I say that the way I did because there's discussion as to, whether Adam would have died had he not sinned. And some of that is related to the question of, partaking of the fruit, the sin itself. Is it a direct consequence of the sin itself, or is it a consequence of simply not being in the Garden of Eden? So there's debate over that. But there's universal agreement that now, as a result of the sin, we all die. There's also universal agreement that that we all sin. So this gets into what I call the inevitability of sinning. So someone might say, well, is it possible to live a sinless life, right? So this is part of the debate. And that sort of question is one in which the church fathers thought about, and their conclusion was, you might say it's something like this. Now I'm going to use some terminology that they wouldn't have used, but which is faithful to their position. Okay. So is it logically possible, as a logical possibility, in the sense that it's logically possible there's a McDonald's on Mars? Yes. Is it feasible? Heck no. Because the person who asks that question doesn't understand the severe sense of this propensity to sin. John Cassian, he frequently talked about the carnal desires, right? This is a monk dealing with, how to work out your salvation, how to become more like Christ. And so he is intimately familiar with the carnal desires that humans have. So anybody who's wondering, is it possible to live a sinless life? They just don't get it. They don't get the depth of a human corruption. But the question is, how deep and what's the degree of that corruption? And Augustine goes like a whole nother level than the rest of the church tradition, roughly speaking. So yeah, so there's this universal agreement on what they all held on some sub-doctrines, but there's certainly stark disagreement on some other ones. And so I hope that answers this question. I know we sort of gone into quite a bit, but yeah, we can move on to the next one.
I think I have to ask you because there might be a lot of other people that are wondering what you mean by when you bring up the Greek theological tradition and you're comparing it to Latin.
Yes.
Can you briefly explain that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, maybe I should have done that earlier. Okay, so what I mean is that, the Bible was written in Koine Greek, and so the church comes forth out of a Jewish and Greek culture. So you see this, we'll call it a migration. You see this migration, especially in the book of Acts. You see it in Paul's letters, that, the first Christians were Jews, but they brought in the Gentiles. And these Gentiles were at first Greek, and then you see Roman. Now, they were all part of the Greek culture, by and large, spoke Greek. And So many of the church fathers who lived in the East, think of looking at a map of the Mediterranean, and if you drew a line down the middle, roughly speaking, on the right side is the East, on the left side is the West. I'm just painting with broad strokes here. The East wrote, spoke in Greek, thought in Greek, Greek ways of thinking. And as Latin grew as the dominant language in the West, that became the main way of writing and speaking in the West. But in the East, they continued writing in Greek. So for a time, there are these two languages within the Christian church. And this is highly relevant when you get into like the Council of Nicaea, because there are miscommunications happening. Sometimes there's miscommunications happening between the old Greek and the newer Greek. And so what it meant, when someone said something, it was unclear what someone meant. Did they mean person? Did they mean substance? Sometimes a word has multiple meanings. So, maybe we should avoid those words. Okay, so that's what I mean when I talk about the East and the West, the Greek and the Latin. You see these separate traditions. So the Greek tradition is older. The Latin tradition is newer. Think newer to, say, 500 AD, right? The Christian Latin tradition, that is. So yeah, that's what I mean when I talk about these broad divisions.
So the Augustine would be considered which one?
Latin, the Latin West.
And the Gallic monks?
So the Gallic monks,
sorry.
Gallic, the Gallic monks, they wrote in Latin. They lived in modern day France, so in the West, in the 5th century. And John Cassian, however, comes from the Greek tradition. So he came from the East. So imagine someone who would come from the Middle East today to America, and they bring their culture, their understanding, their ways of life with them. And let's say they spoke Arabic, but they also knew English. Okay, so what are they going to do? How are they going to communicate their values, their way of living, their theological beliefs? Are they going to write in America? Are they going to write a book in Arabic? No, they're going to write in English. So in the same way, John Cassian comes over to a different culture, and he establishes 2 monasteries, and he writes in Latin. One of the works is called the Institutes, and this is basically the formal way that a monk should live. It's like a rule book. Hey, here's what you do if you want to be a monk. And here's the 7 deadly sins, 8 deadly sins back then. And here's what you can do to fight against them. And the conferences are a sort of, they are I don't want to say historical fiction, but they are a way of communicating what the Egyptian desert fathers taught about monastic life. And it's likely the case that these conversations that happen in the book did not happen explicitly word for word this way, but this is the way in which Cassian decided to communicate these teachings, was in a conversational format. So that's the conferences. And then, of course, I've already mentioned on the Incarnation, his work against Nestorianism. So those are the 3 works that we have surviving of Cassian. And he's important for pointing on this cultural transportation, if you will. Then Vincent and Faustus are simply products of that new tradition in Roman Gaul. So they wrote in Latin, likely didn't know or speak Greek, and so they were part of the Latin theological tradition, but with that Eastern bent because of the infusion that Cassian brought to the Latin West.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so what about today? Is there still that kind of split, so to speak?
There are ideological splits, and now there are even more linguistic splits, because the Christian church has grown. So you have authors writing in all sorts of different languages. Italian. There was one article I had I paid someone to translate for me because it was written in Polish. It was a Polish theological article, and I couldn't read it. And so, I mentioned and obviously disclose that, that I'm at the mercy of my translator when I was engaging with what the author was arguing.
Right.
That was about Vincent's Excerpta, the document discovered in 1938. There are authors writing in South America, so you have all sorts of language barriers now.
Okay.
But at the same time, with the power of the internet, we can benefit. I would have, if I lived 150, 200 years ago, I never would have been able to translate some, Polish article. I mean, it wouldn't have been Polish 200 years ago, but you get the idea that because we are alive today, we can benefit very much from the power of the internet. Online translators, even, they do basic jobs, but that we have other experts who are linguists and can translate that stuff. So
What about denominational, like, influence? Is there a certain type of denomination or is that Catholicism that's still
right? So yeah, there are more, but there are three big camps in Christendom: Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism.
Oh.
And Protestantism comes from Roman Catholicism. So, but those are still three large camps. Within Protestantism, there are many sub-camps: Lutheran, Anglican, Reformed, Methodists. The Methodists come out of the Anglicans. The Presbyterians come out of the Reformed. The Baptists, and then you get Roman Baptists, and so there's all sorts of sub-camps, and you see how this happens over the course of 500 some years. And but don't be mistaken, even Roman Catholics have their own sub-camps and their own philosophies. Same with the Eastern Orthodox. So
yeah,
that it happens, just doesn't happen as frequently or stark as in Protestantism.
got it. Okay. Another question by the same person: who introduced the idea of guilt and damnation from birth as a result of original sin?
This is a very good question. Wow, great question. That's a matter of debate because you see some authors using the term guilt, and there can be some debate as to what they mean by guilt. Do they mean that we have the guilt of Adam, or is it our guilt that they're talking about? So if I had to give a one-word answer, I would say unknown. And that's just because that question is too complex. Who was the first? You could find an author who was the first to use the word guilt, but there's debate again over as to what that author meant. So Ambrosiaster might be one of those. That's my first thought, Ambrosiaster, but it's debated as to what he meant. So,
okay,
which basically just means we can't know either way. With Augustine, we can know for sure because he wrote far more robustly what he meant and clarified, and it's far clearer that he means that the infant in the womb has the very guilt of Adam, because we were in the loins of Adam. There's this metaphysical connection. It's called metaphysical realism, and this is one of the views that Augustine held at a certain point in his writings. That's a very good question. And yes, the answer is unknown in terms of who was the first.
Okay, and last question from the same person: why would the Western Church silence their own French Gaul monks and priests to side with the Alexandrian Church?
Why would they silence them? So that's an interesting way of phrasing the question. And some believe that the Second Council of Orange, which took place in the 6th century, was the repudiation of these Gallic monks. In my dissertation, I'm actually not persuaded by that. And now there are going to be other theologians who are sympathetic to, say, provisionism, but still think that, but they just kind of ignore it because it was a regional council, and we Protestants, we go with what Scripture says, so we don't recognize the authority of that. So it remains to be seen that silencing these Gallic monks is what happened at the Second Council of Orange. But interestingly enough, let me just give a tip here. If someone's in a conversation about this and how semi-Pelagianism was deemed a heresy at the Second Council of Orange, read the canons, because if semi-Pelagianism was deemed heretical, so was Augustinianism. I mean, it's clear that this council did not give an endorsement to Augustinianism, and in fact rejected a number of the positions that he held. So, the verdict is still out on that issue. The position I take in my dissertation is that the council was simply a reaffirmation of the heresy of Pelagianism. And I come to this conclusion, and this is going to be, some people are going to think this is a novel conclusion that I'm presenting here. The reason why is, as I'm analyzing in my writings here the views of John Cassian, Vincent of Lorraine, and Faustus of Rheims, you compare their views that I've defended, with my interpretations, with these canons, these explicit, condemnations, and you can go line by line and say, well, wait a second, that's not what Cassian believed. That's not what Vincent believed. That's not what they believed either. No, that's not what they believed either. And you just keep going down the list. And you come to the end and you're like, well, wait a second. This doesn't condemn anything they believed. So what is it condemning? So that's why I argue that it's just a reaffirmation of the condemnation of Pelagianism. So the scholars can get into the weeds on it, and I'm happy to, debate the position I've had. And I'd like to say you can read about it in my book, but it's not published yet. But hopefully, this year I'll get a contract and we'll get this guy up in the marketplace.
Yeah, well, maybe if someone's watching this video like a year later.
Well, it sounds like your questioner has been following me perhaps for a couple years, because I've had a few interviews on this stuff, and he's been interested. So I'm grateful for those that are interested.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the next person, Frank of Christ. He has two questions. So the first one, how did we get the knowledge of good and evil if we never ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? If we got this knowledge from Adam and Eve, isn't this proof that we have original sin?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure if I want to go into it, but I will say that we have proof of original sin, no matter how you answer that question. So I think it would be a non sequitur. So you could think either way, that they ate the fruit from the knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or they didn't. And either way, we still have this moral knowledge. The fact that we have the moral knowledge is also indicative of, moral obligation that we have, and that every person has. And I also think that's a strike against, I think, the Reformed view of total depravity. And Cassian talks about this, the sense of moral knowledge, and what he calls the seeds of goodness that remain in us. So, and looking at other church fathers as well, seeing the same phrase, what's translated as seeds of goodness. This is another indicator that Cassian inherits the Greek theological tradition because of this phrase. So I'll just say, we can think we have original sin, however we answer that question.
And the second question, yes, when Adam and Eve sinned, their flesh was corrupt and would die. Does that include their reproductive seeds? If not, why not? And I asked for clarification, and he wrote, so if Adam and Eve's flesh body is corrupt because they sinned, doesn't that mean that when they have a baby, their baby is born with a corrupt body that will die? And then he said, First Corinthians 15:53, for this corruptible must put on incorruption. I don't see how your corruptible flesh can become incorruptible just by having a baby. The sperm and the egg is still our flesh, right? And he thinks that this is why Jesus had to be born of a virgin. It didn't include man's seed. And he quotes Romans 5:12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men.
Yeah. Okay. A lot to deal with here. So one, this gets into the debate as to the transmission of original sin. How is original sin transmitted? And this is debated by philosophers, theologians. I had mentioned Augustine's position already, called Augustinian realism. The idea that there's a metaphysical and also physical connection. So in this sense, yeah, it's passed on through the seed, through semen. And this is why the Roman Catholic Church believes that Jesus had to be born of a virgin. Now, in principle and theory, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. I think my dispute is with the sub-doctrines of which original sin is passed on, but others hold to alternative views of how original sin is passed on. So there's like what's called a mediated imputation of sin, so that, we get original sin when we sin. And this is far more closely connected to like the analogical view that we are sinning like Adam. So yeah, this is debated. But let me say this too, that Augustine came to believe that because we are so corrupt and that sin is passed on through the seed, he believed that sexual intercourse was sinful, even within a marriage. So the act itself, and you just sort of get perplexed as to how one could come to that conclusion when the scripture seems to teach to the contrary. And I think many of us recognize, well, it's because his theological beliefs took him, astray. So that sort of ends up being funky for him. And but back to the questioner's question, yeah, in principle and theory. So to bring it back to my research, Faustus of Ries, he seems to hold a sense of transmission from the seed, but he doesn't fully agree with Augustine on what was transmitted, just that it was transmitted through that. So yeah, it's complicated. And sort of like with many issues, as you research them more, you realize, oh, those things weren't right, or I didn't know as much. And here's sort of my position now, but yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, I think, do you know Heiser?
Michael Heiser?
He has his own beliefs on that topic as well, right? If anyone wants to go check that other explanation out. That's a really interesting topic, and it has a lot to do with the Catholic Church, right? And
yeah, like I said, I don't think we Protestants have to be opposed to the idea that the incarnation must have been from a virgin. So if original sin is passed on through the seed of man, in theory, I don't think we need to have this, no, that's not how it happened, but I think just because Catholics have had a more formulated view on the matter, I'll say, doesn't mean we have to disagree with it.
Okay, and I think the next question is why a lot of people don't want to accept that as the only option. Heaven Bound asks, are babies guilty from birth or only when they consciously start to break God's law?
Yeah, again, this gets into the sub-doctrine of guilt. My own view is what's commonly called the age of accountability, or it's the latter option that he presents there. So I do not think that babies in the womb or newborns are guilty of Adam's very sin. And so they obviously have a corrupted human nature, but I don't think that a corrupted human nature would make them guilty in God's eyes. And the question is, guilty of what? So yeah, that's sort of a short answer, and I've probably already addressed that a little bit in our session. So
So we have 3 more questions, and the next one comes from Baxter Williams. If the original sin was the fault of Adam, Eve, or even the devil himself for tempting them, why did God punish snakes in response? I thought that was an interesting question.
oh, I'm not an OT scholar, so I would punt to an Old Testament scholar on this one. Again, my focus has been more on what Adam has passed on to his posterity. And so, yeah, why would God punish snakes is certainly related in a way, but yeah, not my area of pursuit in studying the divine justice of God and poor snakes.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what theologian is out there that actually does deal more with like the snake's involvement, or that has more to do with the study of Genesis, right? How it is
Yeah,
read
and I'm
and
sure that,
interpreted.
there are going to be different takes as well, like what the theological meaning is, and, debates over genre. And
Right.
yeah, so I would just encourage the questioner to explore some OT guys, OT authors, to see what they may say.
Okay. And next question by Baptized by Jesus. Did original sin die in the flood?
Did original sin die in the flood? That was the question? Okay. No. I don't think that original sin was wiped out from the flood. I think that Paul makes it clear that Adam has passed on something to his posterity, and that continues to the present day. But praise be to Christ, who comes to save all men. Which reminds me, I do want to say this. One of the questioners had been quoting Romans 5, which of course is a great passage of scripture. It's frequently employed by Reformed to try to defend their view. It's really not successfully employed by Reformed folks in these debates, because Reformed folks want to read this very woodenly, very rigidly. And they think that in spite of the mistranslation that Augustine had, their view can still come forward from the text. But they read it so woodenly and rigidly, they don't continue reading, because if you continue reading just a couple verses later, if you were to maintain that wooden, rigid hermeneutic, you'd have to be a universalist, because Paul says that Christ comes to save all men. So all of a sudden, it's no longer all means all. They have to make a shift. And that's just, frankly, that's special pleading. And so, yeah, I don't think there's consistency here. Instead, I think a more appropriate interpretation of Romans 5 is to view Paul as making a loose comparison between the way of Adam and the way of Christ. The way of Adam is death. The way of Christ is life. And Paul uses multiple illustrations to demonstrate this point. And I think that's all he's doing. So to take it any further, or, leads to this wooden, rigid approach. And I think if one were to be consistent, you'd have to be a universalist, if that's the way you want to interpret the passage. And of course, I don't, and I don't think Reform should either. So they should give up that hermeneutical interpretation.
And the provisionist perspective is asking, can I affirm original sin and reject imputed guilt and total depravity?
Yeah, so just as a matter of logical possibility, sure. Can you accept original sin and reject imputed guilt and total depravity? Yeah. You can. Of course, it's very important for us to define our terms because, you might, because they're related, you might have some robust sense of original sin, which calls for the inheritance of guilt. But yeah, so it's a matter of clarifying our terms. What do we mean by these terms? What does it mean, total depravity? Is that different than depravity? I mean, sometimes it's just total is used for emphasis, but really doesn't have any significant addition to the theological debate. So yeah, in principle, I don't see why not. In fact, I do affirm original sin. I deny the inheritance of the guilt of Adam, and I deny total depravity as I understand the Reform to hold it. I do think that there are some humans who are depraved, but that's different than what Calvinists believe about total depravity. So, yep. So it all depends on clarifying terms.
Right. Do you have any advice on how to have conversations about these topics, especially with people who may disagree with us?
Yeah. Well, as I just demonstrated, clarify our terms. Sometimes these words are thrown out. They'll say, "Oh, you deny original sin," and you're like, "Well, wait a second. No. Just because I don't think we inherit the guilt of Adam doesn't mean that I deny we're mortals, have a propensity to sin, et cetera, et cetera. That we have a corrupt nature, carnal desires." So clarifying our terms and what we mean can be really important in these debates. So that's my first piece of advice. Second piece of advice is to read the primary sources. That can be very helpful before we critique our opponents. As a go-to, first seek charity. Try to understand your opponent and what they mean. Ask clarifying questions. Hey, do you mean this? By this, when you say this, did you mean this? And that way you can understand what your opponent's saying so you don't jump to a conclusion. So I think that can be helpful. And yeah, so just those three pieces of advice. I think if we did that, we'd have more constructive conversations. And then, of course, I could, give practical tips about if we were to go real deep on, how to interpret certain biblical passages and all that. But that would put us on another 2-hour interview. So,
Right. Okay. And how about for someone that wants to go deeper into learning about original sin and the topic, what resources would you recommend?
yeah. So for people wanting to learn more about original sin, there are a number of resources. I've got a number of books. I've got a section on my shelf just on that. I really enjoyed. Now, this is a book you won't be able to buy, but if you can access a library, there's the Brompton Lectures, are a set of lectures at Oxford University way back in the day. 1924, I think, was N.P. Williams, and his book is called The Ideas of the Fall, and that is a thick book. I don't know if you might be able to see it if I try to point to it. There, thick one, Ideas of the Fall and Original Sin, N.P. Williams. So if you can get that at a library, that's a great one to start with if you want to do a historical survey introduction. If you want something simple but also goes beyond my time period, I had mentioned Tatha Wiley and I couldn't point it out. Let me do a quick Google here. I think the book's just called Original Sin, Origins, Developments, Contemporary Meanings. And that is available on Amazon. Not for 100 and something bucks, but I see some for under 25 there. So that's another good book. She also goes into later medieval views, feminist views of original sin. I mean, not relevant to my interests, but for someone who may want to explore a broader scope and other authors, that's a good place to start as well.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. What about if people want to follow you, learn more about what you do? Where can they go?
Yeah, they can go to veracityhill.com. I've got all my podcast episodes. I did a podcast for 4 years and 200 episodes, a lot of interviews there. I've got some blog posts. I've got this 6-part series called Misquoting Ehrman. And also you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm trying to be more intentional about posting my videos on YouTube these days. And we've got a neat series that's coming out soon. Some animated videos of me sort of answering questions for YouTube Shorts, and also our TikTok channel that we've, more recently started, but we're trying to grow. So if anyone's on TikTok, you can follow Veracity Hill on that as well.
I saw on your Facebook, I think you're involved with Defenders Media.
Yeah, so Defenders is the nonprofit that I started. So we basically do media work for apologists. And so, we've got some clients, and then we've got some ministries that we own and operate ourselves. So Defenders Media is the 501c3. So for those wondering, is Veracity Hill does it have board of directors and whatnot? It's under that umbrella organization, Defenders Media. So a lot of our work is online ministry. We do some local stuff as well, but especially in COVID world, a lot of it's online, all the more so. So yeah. And if anyone has questions about media support, you can go to defendersmedia.com. There's a contact form. I'd love for you to reach out and see how our team of workers might be able to help you.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurt, for your time and for helping us better understand this topic and answering our questions, and for doubling our initial time.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun doing things like this.
Okay, and if you'd like to see more interviews and videos having to do with the Christian life, theology, and apologetics, please subscribe to this channel and visit my website, susanmorales.org, to learn more about projects that I am involved in. Thanks so much, Kurt. God bless.